But onto the Citra Session IPA. So you'll notice that this is by far the haziest of all our beers. Depends on which batch you got. So I tried to pull batches that were the same as everyone's, but it looks like this one was canned a couple days ago. So you'll have a moderate haze, maybe a higher amount of haze on it. I'm actually a little jealous that you all, I think, likely have last month's batch of Citra or the prior months, because I personally prefer Citra with a little age on it. So with Citra, I obviously get kind of a citrus, but more of a sweet lemon, like not overly sweet, but the same kind of lemony flavor you might get from like a limoncello, as opposed to, you know, the lemons that you might pick up at the grocery store. And kind of rounded out by a slight melon aspect to it, like a honeydew type of melon.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Which I think is really nice. I think a lot of people think we just use Citra hops because it says Citra Session IPA. Citra hops are, you know, the hops all the cool kids are using these days. It's citrusy, it's bright, it has a very distinct flavor, but also its name alone is a great marketing term. And I think that is largely has to do with the success of Citra hops. Now, the reason this isn't entirely Citra hops is because I don't think they should be a standalone hop in a beer. They can be very sharp and citrusy, and a little grassy as well. So maybe some lemongrass to it. So we rounded out with Bravo, which is a slightly more orangey hop, kind of like the actual flesh of an orange, not orange zest, but not too much of the astringency of the rind, more of just the flesh, which I think balances that sharp citrus note out a lot. And then on a lot of our cans, you'll see Warrior hops listed. And Warrior hops are kind of I don't want to say unpleasant aroma, but just not interesting. You might smell them and say, oh, this smells like a hop, I think, but it has nothing that jumps out at you. So we actually use those for a bittering addition. So hops will give you both a lot of your fruity or your spicy or your grassy aromas in certain beers, but they'll also be responsible for almost all of the bitterness. And that is from the alpha acids in the hops. When you add them to the beer at the beginning of the boil, you're actually changing those alpha acid molecules into iso alpha acids, and those we detect as bitter flavor compounds. So the more hops you add during the boil or before the boil, the more bitter the resulting beer would be. And the hops you add towards the end or after the boil, you're going to get a lot more of those aroma compounds, the fruitiness, the delicate, sometimes grassy notes, sometimes spicy notes that would otherwise just be boiled off. So we got a question in the chat that asks, what differs in the brewing approach for a session IPA versus a regular IPA? This is a good question. And it's actually a question I ask myself all the time with this Citra Session IPA. I think of them as just totally different styles. I tend to not even think of both of them or the Session IPA as an IPA in my mind. So with the Session IPA, you don't want to go high on any kind of caramel malt, which you will add to a lot of IPAs. There's a much higher level of bitterness to, say, a classic West Coast IPA that you need to balance out with the maltiness of the beer. So you'll add not a lot, but a noticeable amount of caramel malts to a big full strength IPA, and that will leave a residual sweetness in that beer that will play really nicely with the large level of bitterness. Whereas with the Citra Session IPA, you don't want too much residual sweetness. Everything is toned down a little bit. The aroma is slightly toned down. The intensity of the aroma is slightly toned down, and the bitterness is certainly toned down. And if you had, the same or even like really any detectable amount of caramel malt, I think it throws the beer off balance. So rather than a caramel malt, we're actually using a Munich style malt, which is kind of in between your pale Pilsner malts and your darker caramel malts. So when we talk in brewing about color, or color of malt or color of beer, when you're talking color of malts, you're talking degrees lava bond. And there's just, it relates to the kilning of the malt itself, but pale malt, say, is 2 degrees lava bond, whereas the crystal we'll use for an IPA is 45, and the Munich that we will use in the Citra Session is 20. So kind of, meets the two, but doesn't overpower it and sweeten it up too much.
So I've kind of a related question too. A lot of people think of IPAs as, and generally, it's true that IPAs tend to have a higher alcohol content, tend to, be a little bit, like you said, intense, kind of more fuller beers. In terms of brewing, like how do you go about sort of determining that alcohol content and regulating it? Because now it does seem like some of these double IPAs are getting really high in alcohol, and then you can also go back to a Session IPA. So
sure.
What's kind of your approach to like alcohol by volume?
Sure. So alcohol by volume, when I'm making a recipe, I think through all of this. I think, how do I want the aroma to be? How do I want it to taste, the bitterness, residual sugars, and of course the ABV. That's a huge, stylistic component of a beer, but also just, a huge aspect of when you're buying a beer. What kind of beer am I looking for right now? So alcohol by volume is determined, to put it very simply, how much grain are you putting into this beer? The more grain you're putting in, the higher the alcohol is going to turn out. But you're obviously controlling the residual sweetness at the end with how much sugars are present from the beginning. So every single malt has a theoretical amount of extractable sugars in it, and the maltster will give you that information. So you can build a recipe from there, knowing the constraints and how your brewing system operates. And you also have to know your yeast. So does my yeast like to, leave a lot of residual sugars? Or does my yeast like to eat all of the available sugars until it's totally dry? And then with that kind of knowledge, you can make an educated guess as to where your alcohol is going to be. And with that knowledge, you can also adjust your brewing process. So in brewing, you have the mash, which is when you grind up your grains, mix it with hot water, and that hot water will activate enzymes present in the grain that will convert the starches into sugars. So it'll go from very starchy, very grain-like to very, very, very sweet. And you can control that mash to get a desired sugar profile for your beer. So there's a lot of different things you can do. The main one being more grain, higher alcohol, and then you go from there.